The dust of Redemption Creek was a character in itself. A fine, rust-colored powder that coated everything, the wooden facades of the saloons, the faded awnings of the general store, and the stoic, sun-baked faces of the townsfolk. It settled on the black crepe of Elias Thorne's best suit, a silent, grim reminder of his grim profession. At 28, Elias was the town's photographer, a trade he'd learned from his father, and one that, in this unforgiving age, was as much about death as it was about life. His studio, a small clapboard building on the edge of town, was his sanctuary and his prison. Inside, the world was a hazy, subdued blur of sepia and grey, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and old paper. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced pioneers, proud families, and, most disturbingly, children. Not children playing in the sun, but children frozen in an unnatural stillness, their eyes closed or propped open with delicate, almost imperceptible wire frames. This was the trade of post-mortem photography, a practice born of a time when infant mortality was a grim reality, and a photograph was often the only memory a family would have of their lost child. Elias had performed this duty for nearly a decade, his hands steady, his heart a hardened vessel. He had perfected the art of making the dead look alive, of capturing a final, peaceful image for grieving parents. He knew how to pose a child in a chair, a favorite toy clutched in their lifeless hands, or to arrange them as if sleeping, nestled in their mother's arms. The townspeople, though wary of death, trusted him implicitly. He was a professional, an artist in a morbid medium. But today was different. The stillness was not of a neighbor's child, but of his own. Clara, his youngest sister, lay on a velvet chaise lounge, her tiny hands clasped over a worn-out doll. Her long brown hair, usually a tangle of curls, was meticulously brushed and laid out around her head like a halo. Her face, pale and waxy, was a blank canvas of innocence, a profound, chilling piece that looked nothing like the spirited girl she had been. Lily, a few years older, was in a separate room, her small frame rigid beneath a starched white sheet. She had been more vibrant, more talkative, a fiery spirit that had been extinguished far too soon. Elias had told himself he would treat them just as he had every other child, with the detached professionalism of an artisan. He would not let his grief interfere. But every time he looked at them, a cold dread coiled in his gut, a sensation that had nothing to do with sorrow and everything to do with a creeping, formless fear. He set up his camera, the large mahogany box with its brass lens gleaming under the single skylight. The room was silent save for the whir of his own breathing. He focused the lens on Clara, the glass eye of the camera seeing what his heart refused to acknowledge. He saw the faint purple mottling on her skin, a discoloration that seemed to have appeared only after death, something he hadn't noticed on other children. He dismissed it as a simple post-mortem change, a natural part of the process. Yet, a tiny nagging voice in the back of his mind told him it was different. His hands trembled as he placed the glass plate holder into the camera. He slid the dark slide out, and then, with a heavy sigh, removed the lens cap. The light flooded in, capturing the image of his sister in an instant, a ghost already immortalized. He then repeated the grim ritual for Lily, his movements a practiced, horrifying dance. When he was done, he packed up the equipment and took the plates to his darkroom. The smell of collodion and silver nitrate filled his nostrils, a familiar comfort that usually grounded him. But as he developed the plates, the images that emerged were anything but comforting. Clara's photograph showed her with that same unsettling, peaceful expression. But just behind her left ear, a faint, dark mark was visible. A small, almost insignificant bruise that had not been there before. He squinted, holding the plate closer to the dim red light. It was gone now, covered by her hair. Lily's plate was even more disturbing. Her hands were clasped together on her chest, a bouquet of dried wildflowers clutched in her fingers. But in the photograph, her index finger appeared to be bent at an unnatural angle, twisted back against the rest of her hand. It was a subtle, almost missable detail, but to Elias, it was a screaming aberration. He hadn't posed her that way. He was certain of it. His meticulous nature would never allow such a mistake. He stared at the two plates, the cold dread turning into a frantic, heart-pounding panic. These were not just photographs of his dead sisters. They were grotesque, impossible portraits of something he couldn't explain. The still, lifeless forms he had meticulously arranged had betrayed him. The peaceful images he had sought to create were now a testament to something sinister, something profoundly wrong. He had to be mistaken. His mind, clouded by grief, was playing tricks on him. He decided to take the photographs again, to prove to himself that his perception was failing him. He returned to the studio, the midday sun now beating down, casting long, harsh shadows. He rearranged Clara and Lily, his every movement a struggle against a burgeoning terror. This time he would be more careful, more precise. He would not let his imagination get the better of him. He reset the camera, checked the lighting, and took the pictures again. Back in the darkroom, the results were even more horrifying. Clara's photograph, now with the new light, showed the bruise on her neck to be a vivid, dark splotch, and Lily's hands, her fingers were now grotesquely contorted, a horrifying mimicry of a claw. His own meticulous work was being undone, corrupted by a reality he couldn't comprehend. He wasn't imagining things. The photographs were changing, or rather, they were revealing something that his eyes had missed, something that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Elias clutched the wet plates, his mind racing. This was not grief, not a trick of the light. This was a mystery, a terrifying one that went far beyond the quiet sorrow of death. It was a secret, locked within the still forms of his sisters, a secret that was trying to claw its way out through the only medium he had provided. The townspeople, who trusted him to capture the serenity of their lost children, had no idea of the dark truths his camera might be exposing. He had to find out what had truly happened to his sisters, and he had to do it before the next family came to his door, before the next child became a macabre subject for his lens. Don't miss the next chapter of this unsettling mystery. To keep up with Elias's dark journey and uncover the secrets of Redemption Creek, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The town of Redemption Creek was a closed system, a self-contained world where everyone knew everyone's business, and a death, especially a child's, was a seismic event. The news of the Beaumont sisters' passing had swept through the dusty streets like a dust devil, a whisper of sorrow and hushed speculation. Elias, lost in his photographic horror, was oblivious to the quiet sympathy and the even quieter suspicion that had begun to fester in the town's collective consciousness. He needed an ally, someone grounded in reason and logic, someone who dealt with the brutal facts of life and death without the romanticism of the camera. He needed Dr. Eliza Finch. Eliza was a force of nature in Redemption Creek, a woman who had fought her way through medical school in the East and had now found herself in the unforgiving West. She was as pragmatic as the land itself, her hands rough from setting bones and delivering babies, her mind a sharp instrument of logic. She lived in a small, tidy house that doubled as her clinic, smelling of antiseptic and strong coffee. When Elias arrived, breathless and frantic, she was boiling water for her morning tea. "Elias," she said, her voice even and calm, "I'm sorry for your loss. I saw the funeral procession pass by this morning." Elias couldn't speak of funerals. He thrust the two wet glass plates into her hands. "Look at them," he stammered, his voice a raw whisper. "Just look at them." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. She held the plates up to the weak morning light filtering through her window. The first was Clara, the peaceful, porcelain face. The second was Lily, the contorted fingers. Eliza's face, a mask of professional stoicism, showed no reaction. She placed them carefully on a clean counter. "They're fine memorial portraits, Elias," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "It's a beautiful way to remember them." "No." Elias's voice cracked. "Look closer. Clara, the bruise on her neck, and Lily's hand. I didn't pose them like that. Her finger, it's broken." Eliza leaned in, her eyes sharp and intelligent, scrutinizing the images. She picked up the plate of Clara. "That's a post-mortem lividity, Elias. The blood pooling in the capillaries after death. It's a common occurrence. You've seen it 100 times before." "Not like that," he insisted, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. "It's a dark mark, like a thumbprint." Eliza sighed, a quiet, weary sound. "Grief plays tricks on the mind, Elias. It makes us see things that aren't there. It magnifies every imperfection." "And Lily's hand?" he pressed, his desperation mounting. "Her finger is twisted. I posed her hands together. I remember it perfectly." Eliza picked up the second plate. She studied it for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. A muscle spasm, perhaps, or the rigor mortis setting in. The body becomes stiff and often contorts in strange ways. It's nothing to worry about. Elias felt a crushing wave of despair. She was seeing what he had hoped she would see. A logical, medical explanation for everything. She was a professional, a woman of science, and his bizarre claims were nothing more than the ravings of a grieving man. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He had to be more direct. "Eliza, they didn't have these marks when I posed them," he said, his voice now low and urgent. "And I'm not talking about lividity or rigor. I'm talking about a fresh bruise, a broken finger." "Elias, I examined both girls after their passing," Eliza said, her voice now edged with a professional authority that left no room for doubt. "They were peaceful. There were no bruises, no broken bones. But the photographs," he said, gesturing wildly at the plates, "they're proof." Eliza shook her head slowly. "They're a reflection of what was. A photograph can capture a moment, but it can't tell a story that isn't there. The human eye, particularly when filled with sorrow, is an unreliable lens." Elias felt a profound sense of isolation. He had come to her for a shared reality, for confirmation of his fears, and she had given him only cold, hard facts that dismissed his experience entirely. The terror he felt was now compounded by a gnawing self-doubt. Was he losing his mind? Was the grief so potent that it was manifesting itself in his very work? "I'm sorry, Elias," Eliza said, her voice softening slightly. "I know how much they meant to you, but I can't in good conscience believe a post-mortem portrait shows me something I didn't see with my own eyes." He snatched the plates from the counter, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped them. "You're wrong," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "You're all wrong." He stumbled out of her clinic and back into the harsh daylight. The dust seemed to choke him, the sun to mock his pain. He had gone to the one person he thought would understand, and she had seen him only as a man in mourning, a man on the verge of a breakdown. He was alone in this. The photographs were his only witnesses, his only proof that something was deeply and profoundly wrong. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to prove to himself and to Eliza that the images he was capturing were not just pictures of death, but clues to a murder. The thought of it was a searing knife to his heart, but it was a fear that now overshadowed his grief. He would not let the death of his sisters be dismissed as a quiet, natural passing. The camera had shown him the truth, and he would follow that truth no matter how macabre it became. He had to find out what had happened in the last, terrifying moments of their lives and what the photographs were trying to tell him. Elias returned to his studio, the plates clutched to his chest like a terrible secret. He was no longer just a photographer, he was a detective, and his darkroom was his interrogation chamber. He laid the plates out on his work table, the faint red glow of the safe light casting a sinister sheen over the grotesque images. He ignored the gnawing ache in his stomach and the relentless pounding in his head. All that mattered were the clues. He started with Clara's photograph. The bruise. Eliza had called it lividity, but he knew better. Lividity was a purplish pooling of blood, a natural process. This was a bruise, a small, dark and localized mark. It was an injury, but how had it appeared? His mind replayed the moments leading up to her passing. She had been sick, a fever that had come on suddenly and taken her just as fast. The doctor had been called, but by the time Eliza had arrived, it was too late. He had been so consumed with worry that he had barely noticed anything. He had to go back to the source. He needed to find the actual physical bruise on Clara's body. He knew the undertaker, old Jebediah, had taken care of them. He had to see his sister again. But how? The thought of disturbing her rest filled him with revulsion. Still, he had no choice. He had to get proof. He grabbed his hat and walked out into the harsh afternoon sun. The town felt different now, every passing face a potential suspect, every shadow a hiding place for a secret. He walked the dusty path to the cemetery, a small patch of land outside of town, where the silent graves stood as sentinels to the harshness of life in the west. He found the freshly dug mounds of dirt, the two simple wooden crosses bearing their names. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping at his suit, his heart a lump of cold stone in his chest. He couldn't do it. He couldn't dig them up. It was an act of profound desecration, a violation of the little peace they had found. He slumped to the ground, his head in his hands, the grief and the terror a suffocating weight. Then, a sudden thought struck him. He didn't need to exhume them. He had a way of seeing them without disturbing their rest. He had his camera. He would take a photograph of the graves, a final somber portrait to add to his collection. It would be an act of mourning, a tribute, and a way to appease his sense of morbid duty. He returned to his studio, grabbed his camera and tripod, and went back to the cemetery. He set up the camera, the lens focused on the two small mounds. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the landscape. He took the picture. The silence was absolute, broken only by the click of the shutter. Back in the dark room, he developed the plate, his hands steady this time, his mind a steel trap of focus. The image that emerged was of two graves. Nothing more, nothing less. He had been so certain of the camera's ability to show him the truth, but it had yielded nothing new. He felt a wave of crushing disappointment. He had been so sure. He was about to give up when his eyes, now trained to spot the most minute details, caught something on the edge of the plate. A smudge, a small, almost invisible distortion in the image. He held the plate up, and the red light of the safe light caught the surface just so. The smudge wasn't on the plate. It was in the emulsion itself. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail. A small, dark streak that ran from the base of Clara's cross. It looked like dirt. He wasn't imagining it. A tiny, dark line in the emulsion of his photograph. He looked at the other plates, at the photographs of his sisters. He saw the bruise on Clara's neck, the crooked finger on Lily's hand. And now this, a small, dark streak of dirt. He was seeing things that were not there to the naked eye, things that only the camera could reveal. He had to think. What was the connection? The bruise, the crooked finger, the streak of dirt. What did they have in common? They were all subtle, almost invisible anomalies. They were all things that would go unnoticed to the casual observer. But they were there. He was sure of it. He looked at the streak of dirt on the photograph of the grave. It wasn't just dirt. It was a line, a small dark path leading away from Clara's grave. It was a clue. He had to go back to the cemetery, but this time he would not be looking at the grave. He would be looking at the ground. He had to find that streak of dirt, that small, almost invisible sign of a disturbance. He had to find out what had happened on that hill, in the hours after they had been buried. His grief was a distant memory now, replaced by a consuming drive for answers. He would follow every lead, no matter how small or insignificant. The camera had given him the first clue, and he would not rest until he had uncovered the horrifying truth that was buried with his sisters. Elias returned to the cemetery as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in a final, mournful blaze of orange and purple. The air was cool now, the dust of the day settling into a heavy blanket. He had to work quickly before the darkness swallowed the landscape. He knelt beside Clara's grave, his eyes scanning the ground. He had the photograph in his mind's eye, a ghostly map to guide him. He looked for the streak of dirt, the small dark line that had appeared in the emulsion of his photograph. The soil was loose, recently turned. It was a chaotic jumble of clumps and pebbles. But then he saw it. A faint line, almost invisible in the fading light, running from the base of the cross, curving around a small rock, and then disappearing into the general mess of the earth. He traced it with his finger, his heart pounding in his chest. It was real. It wasn't his imagination. He followed the line, his head down, his focus absolute. It led him about 10 feet from the grave and then stopped abruptly at a small, flat stone half buried in the ground. He knelt and brushed the dirt away from the stone. It was smooth, unnatural. He pried it out of the earth with his fingers. It was a slate tile, of the kind used for roofs. But what was it doing here? He turned the tile over in his hand. The setting sun caught a faint indentation on the surface. He ran his thumb over it. It wasn't a crack. It was a letter, a capital E. He turned it over again, holding it up to the light. It was an E, all right. It was a perfect, clean impression, as if a sharp object had been pressed into the soft stone. Elias's mind raced. An E. Elias Thorne. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But the streak of dirt leading from his sister's grave, the unnatural stone, the letter. It was too much to ignore. Someone had been here. Someone had left a mark. But why? He heard a sound behind him and whirled around, his hand instinctively going to his hip, though he had no gun. Standing a few feet away, her silhouette a stark outline against the twilight sky, was Dr. Eliza Finch. "I knew I'd find you here," she said, her voice soft. "The town's been talking. They say you're losing your mind, Elias. That you're consumed by grief." Elias stood up, clutching the tile in his hand. "They're wrong," he said, his voice raw. "I'm not losing my mind. I'm finding a truth, a terrible one." Eliza stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "What truth?" He hesitated. He had gone to her with his gut feelings, and she had dismissed them with logic. He had to show her to prove it. He held out the tile. "This," he said. "I found it here. Look." Eliza took the tile, her fingers brushing against his. She held it up to the last vestiges of light. Her eyes, which had been so skeptical before, narrowed. "Where did you find this?" "Near Clara's grave," he said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. There was a line of dirt, a small path from the grave. My camera saw it, even when I couldn't. Eliza looked from the tile to the small, disturbed patch of earth where he had found it. She knelt down and ran a hand over the soil, her touch surprisingly gentle. She was no longer just the town doctor. She was a woman of science now faced with something she couldn't explain. "An E," she said, her voice a whisper. "Why?" "I don't know," Elias said, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "But it's not a coincidence. It's a clue. There's something wrong, Eliza. Something terribly wrong." She stood up, her face grim. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "The bruise, the hand. I dismissed it as grief, as a man in sorrow seeing things that aren't there." She looked down at the tile in her hand. "But this is different. This is a physical object. This is tangible." A sudden wave of relief washed over Elias, so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. He wasn't alone. She believed him. Or at least, she was willing to consider the possibility that he wasn't insane. "I need to know what happened to my sisters," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I need your help, Eliza. I need you to tell me what could have caused these marks." She looked at him, her gaze meeting his with a new intensity. "I can't tell you that without examining their bodies, Elias. And they're buried." "I know," he said, the words a heavy stone in his mouth. "I know." He had already considered this. The thought of digging them up again filled him with dread, but now, with Eliza by his side, the weight of the decision felt a little lighter. He was no longer just a man in mourning. He was a brother on a mission, and he had a partner. "I'll help you," Eliza said, her voice firm. "But you have to promise me something. You have to tell me everything, no matter how small, no matter how strange." "I promise," Elias said, the word a vow. The last of the sunlight bled from the sky, and the stars began to emerge, tiny, cold pinpricks of light in a vast, dark expanse. The two of them stood there in the silence, two figures against the desolate landscape, a photographer and a doctor, united by a grotesque mystery and a shared, chilling fear. The quiet conversation had opened the door to a truth that was buried deep, a truth that would soon cast a long, macabre shadow over the town of Redemption Creek. The plan was morbid, but necessary. Elias and Eliza would return to the cemetery under the cover of darkness. They would exhume the bodies of Clara and Lily, and Eliza would perform a quiet, private examination to look for the marks Elias's camera had revealed. They both knew the risks. If they were caught, they would be seen as grave robbers, their reputations, and Elias's business, ruined forever. But the need for answers was a more powerful force than the fear of social ostracization. They met at the edge of town just after midnight. A full moon, pale and unforgiving, hung in the inky sky, casting long, spectral shadows. Elias carried a shovel and a lantern, the flickering light illuminating the grim determination on his face. Eliza carried her medical bag, the clink of her instruments a macabre soundtrack to their journey. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the dusty road. When they reached the cemetery, the air was still and heavy. The graves stood in silent rows, a silent army of the dead. They found the fresh mounds of dirt and began to dig. The work was slow and back-breaking, the ground hard-packed and resistant. Elias's hands, so used to the delicate work of a camera, ached with the unaccustomed labor. But he pushed on, the thought of his sister's final moments fueling his every movement. They dug for what felt like an eternity, the moon slowly making its way across the sky. Finally, the tip of Elias's shovel hit wood. The soft, resonant thud was a punch to his gut. They had found the coffins. With a renewed sense of urgency, they cleared the dirt away and managed to pry open the lids. The smell was of damp earth and decay, a heavy, sickly sweet odor that made Elias's stomach churn. The moonlight fell upon their faces, a pale illumination on the waxy, peaceful visages of his sisters. Elias fought back a wave of nausea and grief. This wasn't how he wanted to remember them. "Leave the lantern off," Eliza said, her voice a low command. "The moon is enough. We can't risk being seen." She knelt beside Clara's coffin first, her hands, so steady and competent, moving with a practiced ease. She gently brushed the dirt from the girl's face and neck. Elias held his breath, the air thick with tension. Eliza moved a strand of Clara's hair from her neck, and her hand froze. "Elias," she whispered, her voice laced with a cold shock. "You were right." He moved closer, his own eyes scanning the pale flesh of his sister's neck. There it was, a small dark mark, a bruise no bigger than a thumbnail, just behind her ear. It was faint, almost unnoticeable in the dim light, but it was there. Eliza touched it, her fingers delicate. It was firm, not a post-mortem mark at all. It was an injury, "Someone did this," she said, her voice hushed. "This is not lividity. This is trauma." Elias felt a cold rage building in his chest. Someone had hurt his sister, and she had been buried with the secret of her final moments. He watched as Eliza moved on to Lily. She carefully unfolded the cloth from Lily's hands, her movements slow and reverent. She took Lily's hand in hers, the fingers stiff and unyielding. "The rigor is still strong," Eliza murmured. She gently but firmly worked the stiff fingers. "This isn't a contortion from rigor mortis, Elias. This is a break." She held the hand up to the moonlight. Her index finger is dislocated at the knuckle. The finger is not bent. It is broken. Eliza looked up at Elias, her face a mask of horrified realization. "It's an injury, Elias, just like Clara's. Someone broke her finger. Why?" The question hung in the air, a terrifying ghost. Why had someone hurt these children? What could they have possibly done to deserve such a fate? Elias felt a new, more profound layer of grief settle upon him. His sisters hadn't died a natural death. They had been hurt, and the sickness that had killed them was not a fever. It was a person. "Eliza, look at her hands again," Elias said, his voice trembling. "Just look at them." Eliza did as he asked, her gaze tracing the pale, stiff hands of Lily. "What am I looking for?" "The dirt," Elias whispered. "My camera. It saw a streak of dirt on the grave. I found a piece of slate with an E on it. My camera saw the dirt on her hands, didn't it? In the photograph." Eliza looked at the hands, her brow furrowed. "I don't see any dirt, Elias. They're clean." Elias's heart sank. She was right. The hands were pale, a stark white against the dark earth. He had been so sure. The camera had revealed a clue, but the clue had vanished. He felt a sudden, profound sense of despair. He had found his proof, but the proof itself was a phantom. "What is it?" Eliza asked, her voice concerned. "The dirt," Elias said, his voice hollow. It was a clue. The streak of dirt from Clara's grave. It matched the streak of dirt on Lily's photograph, on her hands. Eliza's expression was one of confusion. "Elias, there is no dirt on her hands. They're clean. And what dirt would be left on the grave? The rain washes everything away." Elias looked down at his sisters' bodies, the chilling reality of their physical state, and the phantom clues of the photographs now a confusing and terrifying riddle. He had found proof of their injuries, but the other clues, the E, the streak of dirt, remained an enigma. "I need to take another photograph," he said, the words an unshakable compulsion. Eliza stared at him, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Elias, no, we can't. We need to rebury them now. We can't risk being found." "I have to," he said, his voice pleading. "The camera, it knows something. It's showing me things that my eyes can't see." He grabbed his camera and began to set it up, the quiet conviction in his movements silencing Eliza's protests. He positioned the camera over Lily's open coffin, a stark, morbid portrait. He would not stop until he had all the answers. The sickness that had killed his sisters was not in the air or the water. It was in the soil itself, and it had found a way to leave a trail, a series of clues that only his camera could truly see. The graveyard felt different now. The peaceful quiet had been replaced by a tense electric silence. The moonlight, once a soft glow, now felt like a spotlight on their grim task. Elias set up his camera, his hands moving with the automatic precision of a man possessed. He positioned the tripod over Lily's open coffin, the large wooden box and its lifeless occupant a chilling tableau. He was no longer just a man in mourning. He was a desperate investigator, his camera an unwilling witness to a terrible crime. Eliza watched him, her skepticism at war with the undeniable physical evidence of the broken finger and the small bruise on Clara's neck. "What are you expecting to see, Elias?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. "She's been buried for days." I don't know, Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the camera's ground glass. He adjusted the focus, the image of his sister's face and hands coming into a sharp, horrifying clarity. The first photographs. They showed me things I couldn't see with my own eyes. I need to know if it's happening again. He loaded a glass plate, slid the dark slide out, and removed the lens cap. The shutter clicked, a sound that seemed to echo in the vast, still night. The moment was frozen, a new entry in a grim photographic ledger. He then moved the camera to Clara's coffin. He focused on her face, on the small bruise behind her ear. He took a second photograph, a silent prayer on his lips that the camera would reveal something, anything, that would give them a new lead. Back in his studio, with Eliza waiting nervously in the main room, Elias retreated to the sanctuary of his dark room. He felt a profound sense of isolation, the red, safe light a singular eye in the enveloping darkness. He developed the plates, his movements deliberate and slow, the chemical smells a pungent perfume of dread. The first plate, the one of Lily's body in the coffin, emerged from the developer. Elias held it up to the dim light. He saw the peaceful, waxy face. He saw the clean, pale hands. And then he saw it. Not on her hands, but on the white sheet that covered her body. A faint, almost invisible smear of dark earth, right where her hands had been resting. It wasn't there to the naked eye, but the camera had captured it. It was so faint, so subtle, that it could easily be mistaken for a shadow or a flaw in the emulsion. But Elias knew better. He had seen the way the camera revealed the unseen. He then developed the plate of Clara. The image of her face, with the tiny dark bruise behind her ear, was horrifying in its clarity. But his eyes were drawn to the bottom of the plate, to the velvet chaise lounge she had been placed on. There, at the edge of the frame, was a small, dark speck. It was too small to make out, too faint to be anything definitive. But it was there. And it was exactly where the streak of dirt had been in the photograph of her grave. He emerged from the darkroom, the two wet plates clutched in his hands. Eliza looked up, her face pale with worry. "Did you see anything?" she asked, her voice tight. Elias held out the plates. "The camera sees things," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. "It sees what's left behind." He showed her the plate of Lily. "Look here," he said, pointing to the faint smear of dirt on the sheet. "The camera sees the dirt, the remnants of the soil. It's a trail." Eliza squinted, her eyes straining to see the faint mark. I can't really make it out," she said. "It's so faint." "I know," Elias said, "but it's there. It's a clue. And on Clara's plate, there's another speck of dirt. The camera is following the trail of a disturbance, a trail that led from their graves back to my studio." Eliza took a deep breath, her mind working furiously. "What does it mean, Elias? Why would a murderer leave a trail of dirt?" "I don't think it was the murderer," Elias said, a new chilling thought taking hold. "I think it was the bodies, my sisters. I think something happened in the ground, in the soil itself. Something that left a trail." Eliza's face paled. "That's impossible, Elias. Bodies don't move. They don't leave trails." "I know," he said, the words a confession of his own growing madness. "But my camera doesn't lie. It's showing me a truth that my eyes can't see." He looked at the photographs, at the horrifying, beautiful images of his dead sisters. The photographs are a record of their final moments. They are showing me the physical evidence of what happened to them, the bruise, the broken finger, the dirt. They were hurt before they died, and they were leaving something behind. A message. Eliza ran a hand through her hair, her scientific mind struggling to make sense of his claims. "The slate," she said, her voice a low murmur, "with the E on it. Maybe the murderer left it as a taunt. Or a signature," Elias said, his voice grim. "But what does the dirt mean? Why is my camera the only thing that can see it?" Eliza had no answer. She was a woman of science, of reason. She had just seen with her own eyes the broken finger and the bruise. She had witnessed his camera capture a faint, almost invisible clue. The world she knew, a world of cause and effect, of physical evidence and logical conclusion, was beginning to crumble. "We have to go back," Elias said, his voice low and firm. "We have to go back to the cemetery. But this time we don't look at the bodies. We look at the dirt, the soil. There's a sickness in the ground, Eliza, and it's trying to talk to me." He had a new theory, a horrifying, macabre idea that tied everything together. The photographs weren't just capturing the bodies of his sisters. They were capturing the last, desperate struggle of their lives, a struggle that was now manifesting itself in the physical world around him. He had to follow the trail. He had to find out what was happening in the earth, in the very ground where the dead lay. He had to find the sickness in the soil. The following morning, Elias and Eliza returned to the cemetery, a strange and grim pilgrimage. The sun was bright and hot, the air still and heavy with the promise of an unyielding day. The cemetery, in the light of day, was a desolate and lonely place, the graves a grim monument to a hard life. They walked past the silent markers, their boots stirring up a cloud of rust-colored dust. "What are we looking for, Elias?" Eliza asked, her voice a quiet murmur. "What kind of sickness in the soil?" "I don't know," Elias replied, his eyes scanning the ground. He was no longer just looking, he was feeling, his mind open to any and every clue. "The photographs. They showed me a trail of dirt. It came from the grave. It was on Lily's hands. It's a trail, Eliza, a signature." They walked along the path, their eyes fixed on the ground, searching for anything that seemed out of place. But the dirt was a uniform mess of brown and black. There were no marks, no trails. Elias felt a wave of crushing disappointment. He had been so sure. The camera had shown him a truth, but the real world had hidden it away. Eliza knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt from a patch of ground near a neighboring grave. She rubbed it between her fingers, her face a mask of concentration. "It's just soil, Elias," she said, her voice gentle. "It's full of minerals and old roots. It's nothing." But Elias couldn't shake the feeling. He had seen the trail in the photograph. It was real. He had to be looking in the wrong place. He had to think like his camera, to see beyond the obvious. The camera saw things the eye could not. What was he missing? Then, a sudden thought, a sharp, cold jab of realization. The trail of dirt wasn't on the ground, it was on the grave. The photographs had shown him a small, dark smear on the freshly turned earth of Clara's grave. He ran back to the graves, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt beside Clara's grave and looked down. He had been so focused on the surrounding ground that he had ignored the most obvious place. He saw it now, in the harsh light of the day. A faint, almost invisible dark line, a smear of something darker than the surrounding soil, running from the base of the cross down to the edge of the mound. It was a perfect, clean line, and it was fresh. It was not the product of rain or wind, it was a deliberate mark. "Look," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "It's here. It's a line." Eliza knelt beside him, her face inches from the ground. She saw it too, the faint, dark line that ran across the surface of the grave. She reached out and touched it, then pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. "It's not dirt, Elias," she said, her voice shaky. It's something else." Elias leaned in, and the smell hit him, a metallic, almost coppery odor that was sickeningly familiar. He had smelled it on the deathbed of 100 patients, in the clinic of 100 towns. It was blood. His stomach lurched. The trail of dirt was not dirt. It was a trail of blood, a signature, a gruesome painting left on the grave of his innocent sister. The thought of it was a searing knife to his heart, a cold, unshakable terror. The photographs had not been showing him a trail of dirt. They had been showing him a trail of blood, a ghost of a crime that was now fading, but not completely gone. "This is not a natural death, Eliza," Elias said, his voice low and tight with emotion. "This is not a sickness in the soil. It's a sickness in the soul." Eliza said nothing, her eyes fixed on the dark, bloody line on the grave. She was a woman of science, a doctor who had seen the worst of human suffering and the quiet finality of death. But this was different. This was a deliberate act of cruelty, a crime of profound malevolence. "We need to find out whose blood this is," Eliza said, her voice firm, her professional calm returning in the face of this new, horrifying reality. "We need to find out who did this." Elias looked at her, his heart a mixture of gratitude and dread. She was with him now, a true ally. He had been alone in his madness, but now she was a partner in this terrifying quest for the truth. He looked at the trail of blood on his sister's grave, and a cold, unshakable rage took hold of him. He would not stop. He would not rest. He would find the man who had done this. He would find the sickness in the soul. If you've made it this far, you're a true connoisseur of suspense. Don't let the mystery fade. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to be the first to know what happens next in this dark tale. Elias and Eliza left the cemetery, their movements more hurried now, a newfound urgency propelling them forward. The trail of blood on the grave had transformed the mystery from a strange, unsettling riddle into a chilling murder investigation. They had to act fast before the next rainfall, before the next wind, before the trail was gone forever. They walked back to Eliza's clinic, the silence between them no longer one of contemplation, but of grim determination. Eliza went to her medical bag and retrieved a small glass vial and a fine-tipped brush. She handed them to Elias. "Go back to the grave," she said, her voice low and firm. "Take a sample of the blood. I need to examine it. I need to know whose it is." "Whose it is?" Elias asked, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "It's not Clara's or Lily's, I can tell you that," Eliza said. "The blood on the grave is a fresh signature, the killer's signature. I need to know if I've seen it before, if I've treated a patient with a similar wound." Elias nodded, his mind a steel trap of focus. He understood. The blood was a clue, a physical link to a person. He hurried back to the cemetery, the vial and brush a strange and terrible burden. The sun was now high in the sky, the heat oppressive. He knelt beside the grave and, with a shaking hand, used the brush to collect a small sample of the dark, metallic-smelling liquid. He placed it carefully into the vial and sealed it. He returned to the clinic, his body and mind exhausted, but his resolve unshakable. He handed the vial to Eliza. She took it, her face a mask of professional calm, and went to her laboratory, a small, cluttered room in the back of her clinic. Elias waited in the main room, his nerves frayed, his mind replaying the image of the dark, bloody smear on his sister's grave. He didn't know how long he waited. Time had lost all meaning. He was in a state of suspended animation, a grim purgatory of suspense. Finally, Eliza emerged from the back room, her face pale, her eyes wide with a cold, terrifying shock. "Elias," she said, her voice a near whisper, "I've examined the sample. It's not a person's blood." Elias's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's not human," she said, her voice barely audible. It's something else. It's a mixture of things. Minerals, water, and a very small amount of human blood, but not enough to be from a cut or a wound. It's like a trace." Elias felt a wave of confusion and despair. The trail of blood had been a dead end. His mind, which had been so sure of a human perpetrator, was now unmoored, lost in a new, terrifying reality. "What is it, Eliza?" he asked, his voice a plea. "What is it?" Eliza took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on his. "I don't know," she said. "I've never seen anything like it. But it's not the only thing I found. I ran a test on a sample of the soil from the grave. A small sample, from the same spot where you found the smear." She hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal what she had found. "What is it?" Elias pressed. "There's something in the soil, Elias," she said, her voice strained. "A toxin. It's a slow-acting poison. It's colorless, odorless. It causes a high fever, a general malaise, and eventually, a slow and painful death. It's a poison that would be nearly impossible to detect, unless you know what to look for." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. A poison. It made sense. The fever. The quick decline. But who would do such a thing? And why? And what did the strange, almost blood-like substance have to do with it? "Where does this poison come from?" Elias asked, his voice a low growl. Eliza shook her head. "I don't know, but I have a hypothesis. I have a theory. I've been treating a lot of children lately, and they all have the same symptoms. The fevers, the lethargy. I've been calling it the wasting sickness." Elias felt a new wave of horror. It wasn't just Clara and Lily. There were other children. And they were all dying from the same cause. The town of Redemption Creek was under attack, and no one knew it. So the blood, the substance on the grave, it's not a signature, Elias said, the words a difficult, halting realization. It's a reaction, a chemical reaction. The poison, it's reacting with the soil, with the minerals in the ground. The camera, it saw the trail of a chemical reaction, not a bloody signature. Eliza looked at him, her eyes wide with shock and dawning comprehension. "Elias, you're right. The camera. It's not just a photographic instrument, it's a scientific one. It's a way of seeing the unseen, the poison. It's a living thing. It's a fungus, a spore. It's a sickness that is in the soil itself. And it's spreading." The horrifying puzzle pieces of his sister's deaths were finally beginning to fit together. But the picture they were forming was even more grotesque than he could have imagined. They had been killed not by a man, but by a silent, invisible enemy that had found a way into the very earth they walked on. The E on the slate, the small bruise on Clara's neck, the broken finger on Lily's hand, they were all connected, all part of a larger, terrifying plan. Elias looked at Eliza, his face grim. "So the sickness is in the soil. And the photographs, they're a map. A map of where it's been." "Exactly," Eliza said, her voice now filled with a professional determination that had replaced the shock. "The E, it's not a name, Elias. It's something else. We need to find the source. We need to follow the trail, the camera. It's the only thing that can see the truth." The two of them stood there in the silent clinic, two people against a world that was slowly being consumed by a silent, invisible plague. The mystery was no longer about a murder. It was about a sickness in the soul of the earth, and they were the only ones who knew it. They had to find the source. They had to stop it, before the sickness and the silent, invisible deaths took over the entire town. With the horrifying truth revealed, Elias and Eliza became an unlikely team of investigators. Their mission was no longer to avenge a crime, but to save a town. The photographs were their guide, a map to a hidden plague. They started with the oldest portraits in Elias's collection, looking for the telltale signs, the faint smudges, the subtle distortions, the almost invisible clues that the camera had been capturing all along. They worked for hours, the studio now a makeshift command center. Eliza, with her scientific mind, and Elias with his artist's eye, made a formidable pair. They looked at portraits of children who had died years ago, of families who had moved away. The grim truth was there, in the form of a faint, almost imperceptible dark line in the emulsion, a ghost of a trail. They were all connected. The poison, the sickness in the soil, had been here for a long time. "I've been treating these symptoms for years," Eliza said, her voice filled with a weary dread. "The fevers, the malaise, I just thought it was the water or the food. I never thought it was a poison. And the E, Elias said, pointing to a photograph of a young boy who had died 2 years ago. Look at the background. There's a fence, and on the fence post, a small, faded E is carved into the wood. The same E from the slate at the grave. Eliza's eyes widened in horror. Elias, it's not a signature, it's a symbol, it's a marker. Someone is marking the locations where this poison is being spread. The realization was a chilling one. Someone was deliberately poisoning the town's children. But who? And why? We need to find the source, Elias said, his voice grim. We need to follow the trail of the poison. It has to lead somewhere. They looked at the photographs, at the faint, almost invisible clues. They traced the paths, the lines, the marks. It was a macabre game of connect the dots, with the dots being the deaths of innocent children. The trails led them all over town, to the well, to the communal garden, to the town hall. The poison was everywhere. The well, Eliza said, a sudden realization dawning on her. It's the heart of the town. Everyone drinks from it. The sickness, it's spreading through the water. Then we have to test it, Elias said. We have to prove it's the source. They walked to the town well, a large stone structure in the middle of town, the heart and soul of Redemption Creek. The sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows. The town was quiet, the last of the day's chores done. They drew a bucket of water and took a sample. Back at the clinic, Eliza ran a series of tests. She was an expert in her field, and her hands moved with a practiced ease, her mind a steel trap of focus. Elias watched her, a knot of dread in his stomach. He was a photographer, a man of art. He was out of his element, a helpless observer in a scientific battle against a hidden enemy. Finally, Eliza finished her tests. She looked up at Elias, her face a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound sadness. "It's there," she said, her voice a low murmur. "The toxin. It's in the water. Someone is poisoning the well." Elias felt a wave of cold, unshakable rage. The quiet, peaceful town, the town he had grown up in, was being systematically destroyed. And the perpetrator, the person who had orchestrated this quiet, macabre plague, was a ghost, a phantom who left behind no trace except for a ghostly E and a trail that only a camera could see. "The E," Elias said, his mind racing. "It has to mean something. It's not a name, it's a symbol, a key. It has to point to the person responsible." They looked at the photographs again, at the trail of death that led to the town well. The E was everywhere, on fences, on doorposts, on gravestones. It was a signature, a mocking taunt. They had to figure out what it meant. They had to find the person who was poisoning the well. They had to stop them, before the last child in Redemption Creek was laid to rest, and their final macabre portrait was taken. The mystery of the E gnawed at Elias and Eliza. They scoured the town, retracing the photographic trail of death, looking for a pattern, a meaning, anything that would link the symbol to a person. They spoke to the townspeople, asking them about the E, but no one knew anything. It was a ghost, a silent, invisible threat that was slowly consuming the town. Finally, late one night, as they were poring over Elias's oldest photographs, a sudden realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The E wasn't a symbol of a person. It was a symbol of a place. He pointed to a photograph of a child who had died of the wasting sickness 10 years ago. "Look," he said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "The E. It's not carved into the fence. It's part of a sign, a faded old sign, Thorn and Son Photography Establishment." Eliza's eyes widened in horror. "Elias, your family." "No," Elias said, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. "Not my family, my father." He grabbed a lantern and ran out of the studio, Eliza right behind him. He ran to the old house, the house where he had grown up, the house where his father had lived and died. It was a dark, silent ruin, its windows boarded up, its facade rotting. He tried the door, but it was locked. He smashed a window with his fist and climbed inside, the sound of breaking glass a sharp echo in the silent night. The house was a time capsule, a museum of his childhood. He walked through the dusty rooms, the air thick with the smell of decay. He went to his father's old study, the room where he had learned his trade. It was filled with old equipment, chemicals, and stacks of his father's photographs. He saw them now with a chilling clarity. The early portraits, the ones of the children who had died of the wasting sickness, the ones with the faint, almost invisible E in the background. He grabbed a stack of his father's old journals, his hands shaking. He flipped through the pages, the words a faded script of a man he thought he knew. He found it. A page near the end of the journal with a detailed map of the town's underground water system, and on the map a series of marks, small, circular marks, and in a corner a simple, chilling sentence. The final solution. Elias's blood ran cold. The E wasn't a signature, it was a monument. It was the mark of a man who had orchestrated a slow, quiet plague. His father. He read on, his eyes blurring with a mixture of horror and disbelief. His father, a man consumed by a radical, warped ideology, had believed that the world was too crowded, too full of suffering. He had seen the deaths of children as a natural culling, a way to thin the herd. He had created the poison, a slow-acting toxin that would take years to kill, a silent, invisible purifier. The E was a symbol of his mission, a mark of his success. Elias looked at the map, at the circular marks. He had been looking for a person, for a sickness in the soul, but the sickness was in the water. And the well was a part of it, a large, complex, and deadly part of his father's final solution. "He's been poisoning the town for years, Elias," Eliza said, her voice a low, horrified murmur. "He's been killing children." Elias looked at the map, at the circular marks. They weren't just on the map. They were in the ground. They were on the graves of the children he had photographed. The broken finger, the bruise, the trail of blood on the grave. They were all a part of his father's final gruesome act. The poison didn't just kill. It left a trace, a mark on the body, a signature in the very soil. His father had been a sociopath, a monster hiding in plain sight. Elias clutched the journal to his chest, his mind reeling. He had to stop it. He had to stop the poison. He ran out of the house, the map in his hand, a new and terrible mission burning in his heart. He and Eliza ran to the town well, the heart of the town. The well was a large stone structure with a small wooden door. Elias smashed the door open with a rock, and they descended into the dark, damp underground chamber. The smell was of damp earth and decay. They saw it. A large, complex system of pipes and valves, and at the end of the system, a large metal container, the source of the poison. His father's final solution. Elias looked at Eliza, his face grim. "We have to destroy it," he said. They worked quickly, their hands moving with a frantic urgency. They unscrewed the pipes, a rush of black, foul-smelling liquid gushing out. They smashed the container, the sound a loud, final crash. They had done it. They had stopped the plague. They emerged from the underground chamber, exhausted and covered in grime, to a quiet, peaceful town. No one had heard them. No one would ever know. The sickness had been in the soil, in the water, in a man's twisted soul, and it had been laid to rest. Elias walked back to his studio, the old journal in his hands, his mind a quiet, peaceful blank. He sat down at his desk and looked at the photographs of his sisters. The peaceful faces, the haunting clues, the silent, invisible truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. He had found the truth. He had stopped the monster. But the most horrifying truth of all was that the monster had been a part of him, a part of his family, a part of his own tragic, macabre story. He picked up his camera, the lens a reflection of his tired, broken face. He had taken his last macabre portrait, and it was a portrait of a family, a town, and a past that was now finally, irrevocably, at peace.